Let's build some awesome Open API, Swagger API documentation for our REST API we're going to create with Spring Boot. It'll quickly allow us to access the APIs, or we can use Postman. It'll allow us to look at the data content. We can have dependencies like API keys. You can see our content, look at some of the headers, see the standard returns, see any errors that may happen, return types. So the Swagger API will simplify your development and allow you to share your API specification with other developers. So we have a great, amazing API. We can get all of the users. We can get an individual user. We can even get users by email. We can create users. We can update users. And we can delete users. This is great. How does anyone know how to use this? We're not going to share our code with them, so we need to have some sort of API documentation. One of the standard ways to do that is with Open API or Swagger documentation. We're going to go ahead and we're going to set up the Swagger documentation. First thing we need to have is a reference to where things are going to be, and we're going to go through and add a reference in the application of properties. And that'll be springdoc.api-docs-path. And that's going to be in the /API docs. So that's the first thing we're going to add. Second thing we need to do is we need to add something to our POM. And in our POM, we need to add in our Spring docs. So let's go to our POM file. And we'll go down below Model Mapper. And we'll insert this in here. I will right click on the POM XML and go to Maven and reload project. Let's go ahead and stop the project as well. So now we have our Spring doc in here, and this is based on Open API. Okay, so now that we have these components in there, let's take the next step, and we need to add some configuration information. In our application, it should open everything up, and everything should work based on our REST controller, and we can add a level of documentation in our REST controller. And let's start by adding some configuration over in our config files. Let's add a new file in here, and let's call it API doc config. Over here, we're going to, this will be a REST controller or annotation. And we need to add a little bit of Open API information. So we need to give it a title. I'm going to call this SB Demo. And the description is going to be documentation for our SB Demo API application. And we can have a reference to a URL for some license info. We can have a URL for some contact info. Here, I'll actually put in my company, thomasjconsulting.com. And we can put a reference here. I'll say Tom. And this will be Tom at Thomas J. Consulting, which is my email. Okay, so that's the first part of this. Now we have the documentation for OpenAPI configured. Now we need to go through and start creating some documentation in our REST controller. And we can do that fairly quickly here. In our REST controller, we will have a tag. And let's go through and let's give it a general tag using one of the OpenAPI references. And this, we're going to say users. Okay, and we'll just leave it at that, or we can say users API. Then when we actually use an API, let's simply go down to our first get mapping. We need to add some annotation in here. And our first annotation we'll add is an operation. So on our operation for the users, we're going to say retrieve all users. Here we go. So that's our first operation name. And in there, we may have some parameters, we may have some results, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We do need to document what we have as far as our response values, and this is what's coming back. So what's going to come back from this? This should be fairly simple. We're going to get a 200. We're going to say found 0 or more users. This is going to be based on a user DTO. So this is going to be our user DTO. We should not have a 400, but we may have a 402 or 401. Let's call this a 401, and that will be not authorized. So that's a possible return. Okay, so we either get the data that we found 0 or more users, or it's not authorized. So on this, what we'll quickly find is that if we have more than one item, this is going to be an array. So in here, we've defined that we're bringing back a schema of a DTO class. But actually, this is not a schema, this is an array, because it's on a list. And then our response is going to be an array schema. And then we will be implementing that as a schema. Consisting of schema, which is implemented as a DTO class. Okay, so instead of just one object, it's an array of these objects. So let's go through and take a look at this and kind of see what it's going to look like. Let's go ahead and run this. And now we need to open a browser. And we're going to go to HTTP //8100 API docs. And here we see the OpenAPI 3.0 information. And this is all the meta information that we expect. That's not a lot of value. we actually want to see a lot more information here. This is an internal contents, but we want to actually see what the Swagger UI looks like. And here's the Swagger UI. So we have SB Demo, documentation for SB Demo API. Got my name, my website, send email to Tom, and Apache 2.0 license. And we've generated this from our local server. So let's go through and let's see what we have. It is determined that we have a get API, a put API, a delete, a get users, retrieve all users, a post, and a get. So even though we didn't provide any documentation, there's a lot of information that it did get for us. So let's go into the place where we do have some documentation. And notice here it does have that it requires the API key. And then if we look at the response, we can see it returns an array. So let's go ahead and let's try this out. We can give it an API key, which is it is expecting in the header. And if we go back to our Postman, we can see the API key that we set up here. So we'll grab this API key. We'll put the API key in here. Let's actually execute this. We'll see it generates a curl command for us. We can run this on the command line. The URL that it's going to call. And then we can see that we actually have several pieces of data. And we added the same user over and over. We see the response headers and all the information that we have. So this is nice that we can actually see exactly what's going on for all the different items within the API. So now we have documented one endpoint. There's other APIs, endpoints to document. So let's quickly go through and document them. So let's take a look at the retrieve user again, and we'll see the codes that it can return. And the standard code is a 200. And we can also get a 401 return, not authorized. So if we run this without entering in an API key or an improper API key, returns a 403. So I'm going to go ahead and update that. Since it's not a 401, it's actually 403. I'm going to change that to authorization failed. So we'll go back in the API. We'll change this to 403. There we go. So little bit by little bit, we can start showing more information. Let's go through in this document the get user by ID. So it gives us no sample of what's being returned. So we should be able to update the get user by ID. And it's the same approach here. We have the operation. So we'll add an operation name in there. And this is going to be retrieve user by ID. And then we have the responses. Then we can get the responses. And the response values can be a 200. Found the user. matching this ID. And that, in this case, is going to be just a single item. So in this case, it's just a schema. It could be a 403, authorization found, or it could also be a 404. User not found. Okay, so now we have additional information. Let's stop this and let's restart it. We can go back to our Swagger API, refresh this, and now we have retrieve user by ID. We now have the API key required and the ID, and this is the ID for the user. 403 for authorization failed, 404 user not found, 200 found the user matching this ID. Okay, so we're slowly building up this API. We can go through and we have the find user by email as well. Let's quickly go through and update that. Find user by email. Found the user matching this email. User not found, authorization failed. Here we go. Now as we go through and we've added in here user by ID, we can add in here as well to the path variable annotations defining the description of the ID. So in this, we can say ID of user to be searched, to be found. There we go. On the find by email, we can add in similar parameter. We'll call this one email of user to be found. Okay. So now we have all sorts of additional parameters we can put in for our post, our put, and our delete. And let's go through and look at some of those here. We have some parameters for our post, and let's start with the new user, and we can say new user post body to be created. Okay. Now we have a couple elements here as well for posting the user. We can say create user, create new user, and this is going to be a 201. Successfully created new user. We could have a response of 400. failed to create new user. And then authorization failed. Okay. And then for the parameter, we added body to be created. Now for our put, same thing. We have two parameters here, and this is going to be user elements / body to be updated. But we also have this ID, and this is the user ID to be updated. And then we have a simpler parameter for the delete, because this is simply user ID to be deleted. So on our operation name and responses from the delete, we can copy those down to the put, and we can call that update user. We can say successfully updated user for a 200 response. Failed to update user. All right. And we can copy this similar content. This has one more value here, and that would be a 404. User ID does not exist. And that's going to be the same information for the delete. Delete user, successfully deleted user, failed to delete user, user ID does not exist. Okay, so I think we have a handful of information documented for this now. On the update user, we get back some content. On the delete, we do not get back any content. So we need to change this one right here. There's no schema. All right, so let's stop this. Let's go back and see if we have some better documentation. Let's refresh our Swagger UI. And now we have a name for each of these. This is the tag, so if we had another API, we could see the different tags. In here, we have a put, and in this put, we can see that we have a request body that is sent, and this is a reference to the schema. That request body is an update request DTO, and this right here tells you the validation. what fields are required, the little red asterisk. The user DTO. This is the new user request DTO, and notice it has our validation links in it. So let's bump our API to version 1, and I think we're good to go. There we go. Now we have some basic documentation for our API with Swagger.